often heard it said that Shelley had great thoughts but couldn't express them. This doesn't make sense. Words are the bricks of thought. Without them, there is only a mental impulse.
Everybody that I know used to rush out to get the evening press in the country when he was writing. What I mean by that is that in places like where there was a bus coming from Limerick into a Kerry village, it wouldn't arrive till maybe 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, and you'd see people standing around, and if anybody asked them what they were standing around for, they'd say, "We're waiting for Houlihan." Sam Beckett wrote "Waiting for Godot," but in Kerry they waited for Houlihan.
Con came literally down from a mountain in Kerry with something that was indigenous, something that was very special, and something that derived much more from the tradition of the Kerry ballad singer and the bringer of news to the fairs.
Here in the southwest is a land that for generations was tended with an infinity of energy and skill by a people to whom every field and rock and stream had its own being. A people who knew the land because they wooed it intimately, with hand labor, with the spade and the fork and the reaping hook and the scythe. This is a land that grew old without maturing. The images that mold you are potent yet insubstantial, endlessly changing, leaving the questing mind no solid ground. A world that, except in fragments, has gone unchronicled and unmirrored, that has fallen over the cliff of silence.
At home, 2 miles north of Castle Island, we had 5 acres of good land. And up in the mountains 4 miles away, we had a huge amount of bog. You wouldn't make a living out of the land in the bog, but it gave you a deep insight into what it was to be a farmer, what to be a mountain farmer. And even though I've left it now, I have great memories. Memories of putting down the spuds in March, digging them in October. And if they were good, you were delighted at your harvest. So basically, I know what it is to be a peasant, somebody who produces things, food and food basically and fuel. And even though I never go back to it, I'm delighted to have known it.
I had 1 brother and 1 sister. My father, Michael, left school at 12. He got his education in the coal mines in Wales. From my mother, Helen Cronin, I inherited a fierce love of books. I recall great bundles of comics coming from aunts in America, and before I could read, I was enthralled by them.
My mental empire in there is based on Castle Island, and that will never change. No matter how much I travel, I always come back in my dreams and in my thoughts to a little town in the fields, which grew up in the restaurant.
All of this for me is now in the past. But of course, there is no past. It is all around me. I recall the Greek poet Kephafi. In those fields and streets where you grew up, there you will always live, and there you will die. Castle Island grew up in what was an ideal site for a settlement. There was an abundance of water and limestone. It was almost entirely surrounded by marshland, hence the name. Ireland.He, the island of Kerry. The town was built around the old Norman castle on the banks of the River Main. The old town became known as the Latin Quarter and was dominated by such landmarks as Paddy Hussey's pub and McGillicuddy's. Castle Island, London, Paris and Mexico City are my favourite towns. Castle Island, of course, is first. My roots are here. My most abiding image of my hometown is rooted in a spectacle that is part of the past and can be seen no more. It belongs to the days when the people who lived in the little thatched cottages in the Pound Road had no running water and relied on the ornamental pump called the fountain. Until about 30 years ago, its water came in a faint trickle, and if you passed up or down the town on a fine day, you were almost certain to see a coven of women sitting on the base of the fountain, colloguing as they waited for the bucket to fill. I felt that these women knew more about life in general and about the secret world of our town in particular than ever I could hope to divine. I was convinced, and still am, that they had an instinctive knowledge of human nature that put them ahead of Freud and Jung and Adler.
Do you remember the day I met you up the Mom?
Go on.
I was returning from my walk,
I remember, yeah.
and you came over the ditch,
Yes.
and a goose underneath your arm.
A goose?
A turkey.
A turkey, forgot. A turkey.
A
goose,
turkey.
Yes, a turkey onto the cock.
Yeah.
Of course, yes.
And I said to you, where are you going with the turkey?
Yeah, that's right.
And he said, what a question you're asking me.
Back to O'Connor's on the old road.
Yeah.
This is O'Connor.
Uh-huh.
Back to the cock.
And that's right, you have it.
I was a messenger boy. Innocent times.
Innocent times.
At Cork University, I studied Latin, English, history and mathematics. I did my MA in English and then returned home where I made black puddings for Charlie Lenihan.
Charlie Lenihan, he had a butcher shop in the main street, Castle Island. He employed 4 or 5 people making black puddings and white puddings. You wouldn't feel the time going, you know. Con was great company.
Charlie Lenihan and Con Houlihan, they take him out to the pub next door, Charlie Horden's pub. So Mrs. Horden, she'd cook them, and then Con would sample the puddings. He was a famous sampler, Con.
Charlie Lenihan was a brilliant pioneer in agriculture. To our part of Ireland, he brought silage and electric fencing and music in the milking parlour. He also introduced me to mainstream journalism. He founded a monthly paper of which I was the editor. It was entitled The Taxpayers' News, a name that belied its radical nature. It helped to get Charlie elected to Kerry County Council, miles in front at the head of the poll. In every issue we carried a short story from such writers as Guy de Maupassant and Alphonse Daudet. We had 2 excellent reasons for this excursion into the classics. The stories were good, and because the authors were safely dead, we didn't have to pay them. One of our greatest fans was a budding footballer from Ballylongford. He blamed me for introducing him to French literature.
I remember the day that he came into my father's pub in Ballylongford, and somebody whispered, that's the fella that produces the Taxpayers' News. And I was struck immediately by the size of Con's body, and also by the fact that he was a great talker, even though a bit shy, apparently. And he did talk about French literature, and he talked about English literature and American literature. And it was only years later that I discovered that he had written a thesis on the work of the American novelist Stephen Crane. The Taxpayers' News was famous for many reasons, not least because of its headlines. There was a time when D.H. Lawrence's novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, was banned all over Ireland, and there were copies of it apparently in Tralee. And one of the headlines in Con's paper was the literati of Tralee are busy reading Lady C. And his wit and his perception would come out in all the articles he wrote.
It was in this rather eccentric publication that a young man called Jackie Keane first saw his work in print. In another incarnation, the young poet went on to become John B. Keane, a dramatist of some note.
May his grief with awful thirst, may his brains and eyeballs burst, that melted down the that big buffoon. He is as greedy as the sow, and the crow behind the plough, that black man from the mountain shining through.
On the 6th day of January 1952, I set out to make a fudge. I chose England.
A couple of years earlier, I first met John B. after we played against each other in a game of rugby. We became lifelong friends. Our spirits were always in touch.
Con in those days, he was a very important person in Castle Island. Now, he wasn't a character, not that. He was just a very important person and people looked up to him. He was regarded as a genius. He corrected Leaving Cert honours, English anyway, and I think Latin. And he gave grinds. God knows, I don't know if he charged very much for them.
You would see Con striding down through the field in those big long steps, and he'd come out just quite near our house. On arriving at our house, he would usually discuss with my parents whatever work was going on in the farm, the hay, about the bog, or how the cattle were doing. And then the lesson proper would start.
Con taught me Latin, English, mathematics, Irish, or whatever it was that he felt like at the time, because Connie had such a broad encyclopedic knowledge of a whole range of topics that nothing was impossible to him.
Connie was absolutely fantastic at imparting knowledge. He even made maths logical and understandable.
I remember one day he had me doing differential calculus. Now, I was never mathematically inclined at all, but whatever gift he had, we were able to do it, it was extraordinary. The abiding memory was, that we'd always be made very, very welcome up in that house always. It was a pleasure to go there. Time didn't matter, it was between having tea and talking and putting on a fire and whatever else he might do. Or maybe himself and his mother would indulge in a little bit of repartee, which was always a feature of those days too, Yeah, time didn't really matter. Could be 2 hours,
He's a great listener. He is an encourager. He understands the beautiful growing power of praise. Mullinoige agus tukashi. He is also critical. He can criticize you in the most helpful ways. I remember sending him a few poems when I was about 16, and he read the poems, obviously, and he wrote back and he said, "Dear Brendan," he wrote one sentence, "Dear Brendan, you make the right mistakes." And I've never fully understood it, though in my heart I know what he's saying. And it meant an awful lot to me. When I read it first, I was wondering what he actually meant. But he has a way of encouraging you which brings your attention to your weaknesses and your faults. And that is the mark of a good teacher.
The people of Castle Island and its hinterland owe an enormous debt to the Presentation Sisters. They came to our town towards the middle of the 19th century, acquired a few acres of marsh on the north bank of the river, and created an earthly paradise. They gave more than education. They did the proverbial good deeds by stealth. I taught here in the 1960s. Their garden, with its crenellated wall by the river, is my concept of Eden.
I was in charge of the features page in the Kerryman, and we were badly in need of a main writer for the features page. And I'd heard of Con off and on from different people, that there was this extraordinary guy out in Castle Island who wrote very well and had written very well in the past in the Taxpayers' News. And Dan Nolan, the publisher of the Kerryman at the time, I discussed it with him, and he said, great, if you can get him. He said, but I've tried repeatedly to get him to write for the paper, and he refused. So I said, well, I'll go and talk to him anyway. So that began a series of visits to Castle Island and to his home on the Limerick Road, sitting down with his mother and his father, having a meal with them and so on. And then ending up quite often in the Latin Quarter of Castle Island, which was essentially Paddy Hussey's pub. And eventually he did agree to write for us, and that began a long association, and a very fruitful one, I think, for the Kerryman. Well, he wrote about things he knew. He wrote about the countryside. He wrote about country customs, not in any shilly-shally kind of way. He wrote about them deeply and what they meant to people, and what they added to life in the countryside. He could make a ceremony out of going to the bog.
Although it was only a few miles from the world down below, it had an atmosphere all of its own. It is a place wherein one can refresh the spirit. We all need such places. It recalled what D.H. Lawrence said about the messages that rise from the depths of the earth, which we cannot articulate, but that affect us profoundly.
Pinky bug, I don't hear you.
No, pinky bug.
We're too hard, Jimmy. If I had my leg back, I cut off as we're going.
I know. Yeah. How many years in Dublin, Con?
I went in 74.
74.
I went to give a year there, and I'm still there.
Yeah.
But I was over several governors since I worked in my old job. I writing about football, rugby, and boxing, and that. I've been over half the world.
Yeah.
Anywhere I go, around here is my favourite place. Castle Island, you know, down the country there, all around here, Kerry, Scotland. The Kerryman, in my regime there, it was a very liberal paper and a very bored paper, very outspoken. Probably in that country, probably the most outspoken paper in the country. And in very dangerous times, I was very anti-Provo and anti other area, anti-official and Provo. And then it was turned over the road.
The Price sisters, Marion and Dolores Price, they were involved in a bombing campaign in Britain with brief one. These people were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, and after some months in prison, the Price sisters went on hunger strike, looking for a transfer to prison in Northern Ireland. They were forcibly fed for something like 170 days, which was a very painful process, and of course which increased the sympathy for the Price sisters in the circumstances. But Con took a contrary view on what the Price sisters should endure, or what they should be looking for, or what they should not be looking for, and what they were entitled to, because he was very conscious of the death and the injuries in Britain arising from the bombs. This was typical of Con at the time, and what he wrote about Northern Ireland. His attitude was pacific, I would say. We received a direct threat from somebody who was close to the Republican movement at the time, that is the provisional Republican movement, that if the article were published, they knew the article was in the works, because somebody obviously in the Kerryman had told them so, that they would take action against the Kerryman. Well, there were a lot of jobs depending on the Kerryman. And as a result of that, we had a police presence in the Kerryman for a couple of weeks to make sure that nothing did happen. And then, as these things do, it died down. But at the time, it was taken very seriously. We felt it was an issue about the freedom of the press. You know, you mightn't agree with what Con had written, but damn it, he had the right to say it. He wrote his material on butcher's white paper. Obviously, this was an inheritance from Charlie Lennon. I don't know whether Charlie paid him off with a bundle of this paper or what, but he had a lot of it anyway. And quite often he would finish this writing in the Brogue Inn in Tralee and drive over with them and hand them in. He was generally on time with his copy. Con had a very simple style. It looked very simple. Of course, it was deceptively simple. He wrote in very short sentences. I looked at it often and I wondered how the hell he did it, because I certainly couldn't do it. Most people write long sentences with subordinate clauses and all the rest of it. Con just wrote a simple, clear sentence with no complications. As with everybody who's writing at that pace every week, you know, he was running out of material to some extent. It was obvious to me, anyway, and it was obvious to everybody, that he needed to paint on a wider canvas. And we couldn't provide that because he was limited in what he could do for the Kerryman, and he always wanted to write about sport. And as we all know, he did it so well subsequently.
I remember my last day in the bog with little pines. My father and I were working there just the two of us, you see. It was September, and we were putting out the turf, finishing up, you know, basically. And I knew I was going away to a different world, and I knew I'd never work in the bog again, or work for him again. When it came to say 6 o'clock, we poured the remainder of the tea and the water onto the ashes and quenched the fire. I got a tremendous stab in my foot that day. And I always say, in any language, there are three very sad words, but that's time. That even to me was, if I liked, was a kind of a bookmark or a watermark or a landmark. I was given the mountains to go down into the plains.
In 1970, Sean Ward and Liam Flynn of the Evening Press asked me to join their paper. I swore a mortal oath to Sean and Liam that when the time was ripe, I would. But it took me 4 years to keep my promise.
The Irish Press in He had this fantastic newsroom, straight out of the 20s, 30s, 40s kind of film noir, a huge open space. And it took a big man to fill it, you know, and Con was that man. I always had this sense of Con and his movement, of almost like one of those sort of a great bull elephant. He would kind of come in slowly but with certain stately dignity and move to the desk.
Con came literally down from a mountain in Kerry with something that was indigenous, something that was very special, and something that derived much more from the tradition of the Kerry ballad singer and the bringer of news to the fairs than something that, you know, would be written by Red Smith or Hugh McIlvanney. He was the sports journalism equivalent, or the journalism equivalent of what Siggers and Clifford or Brenda Kennelly were doing, and he came from deep in the heart of that tradition.
He could build up in his essays, his articles, a kind of tension of rivalry, which he probably got from Kerry, from the idea of rivalry between villages, that the next village to you is your sworn enemy. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you wouldn't drink pints with them and talk with them, but during the football match and leading up to the football match, there was nothing but primitive hostility showed on both sides. And Con was aware of this, and he was able to write about it.
You long to rise above the common clay, to walk the tightrope between glory and humiliation. The ball is the wheel of all wheels. The white-lined rectangle is the battlefield. Your laurel wreaths are a few words of commendation. Your ultimate honor that somebody refers to you as the footballer.
it would be very hard to explain culturally outside of Ireland what sort of connection that made with what was largely an urban audience, but it made that connection, and within months everybody knew it.
Wayward lad, forgive and forget, still coming there strongly on the near side. Forgive and forget on the near side now as they come to the final.
Yesterday, it was a very cold day in the Cotswolds. But in retrospect, most of those who were on Cheltenham's racecourse will remember the time between 3:30 and 4 o'clock as a fragment of summer. Such was the enormous outburst of emotion that for a little while the thin wind seemed not to matter. And no doubt there are decent men and women who will dip into their imaginations at some distant date and say that they were there. And they will be right.
Sometimes the wordplay would only reach you on the third or the fourth reading. It's wordplay that sometimes comes from the Irish language. It comes from, there are literary references planted in there to American poetry. There are lots of layers, and you could take a Con Houlihan sports piece and read it at several different layers and still come up with something fresh after several readings.
Con is a stickler for correct grammar. He once said that a man who could misplace an apostrophe was capable of anything.
Con Houlihan has variously been described as writer, philosopher, raconteur, personality, literary and sporting man, and sometimes bon vivant.
He always describes himself, and not in a pejorative sense, as a peasant. He describes his background as a peasant background, and he's proud of that. And I think he keeps what he would consider peasant hours. So Con can get up at the crack of day or before and have an extraordinary column finished and done by 7 a.m.
I love to be up before the dawn and be at the river by first light. On those days, I partook of an empty Irish breakfast, a cup of tea. Time was precious. I could go the whole day without thinking of sustenance. I was about 9 when I caught my first trout. From that moment, you could say that I was hooked. Patrick Kavanagh's influence on me was enormous. He made you see your own fields, your own little rivers, and the cows as important. At that time in Castle Island, there was a fishing rod in every house. The great event would be meeting in Hussey's pub or McGillicuddy's pub in the evening to talk about your day's adventures.
I love fishing. I love coursing hares and rabbits. I love greyhounds and fox terriers. And I love birds and I love animals. So if I'd been born in the jungle, I couldn't have been happier.
Con was the first sports journalist to take a perspective from outside of the press box. Sports journalists tend to hunt as a pack. They swap notes, they ask who gave the pass before the pass that led to the goal, they drink together afterwards, they exchange stories, they spend a lot of time in each other's company. Con moved it away to the fan. He was the fan up in the bank. He was, in some senses, the same boy who'd taken the ghost train that used to leave at midnight from Kerry and arrive up for the All-Ireland final. And, you know, he was there with the Coswinter on the terrace. There were people who gathered around just to see him, just to exchange a few polite words with him. One of the Dublin players, who wasn't known for moving forward and taking shots at goal, decided to have a pop one day. And afterwards he explained to his colleagues that he was so off target that he almost hit Con Houlihan, and everybody knew what he meant.
In writing, I try for two aims: to be grammatically correct and to be some way original, some way exciting. And if you go to a game and if you're excited by it, you should be able to make a reason, excite a reader too.
The drizzling rain seemed irrelevant as Dublin moved the ball with the confidence of a grandmaster playing chess against a novice. After 25 minutes, Dublin led by 6 points to 1. It did not flatter them. But perhaps it's true that whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. The ease with which Dublin was scaling the mountains seduced them into overconfidence.
And it's gone very near the end line. Paddy Cullen going out for it. And Paddy Cullen.
Paddy put on a show of righteous indignation that would get him a card from equity. And while all this was going on, Mike Sheehy was running up to take the kick. And suddenly Paddy dashed back towards his goal like a woman who smells a cake burning. The ball won the race, and it curled inside the near post as Paddy crashed into the outside of the net and lay against it like a fireman who had returned to find his station ablaze.
Close your eyes, put that image in your head. It is magnificent. I think it's one of the great images of that entire era in Irish sports journalism.
You could walk away from an All-Ireland when most people's minds are battered by and slightly confused by what they have just witnessed. And he could, within a few hours, produce an article of gripping lucidity.
Timopte against Bonner.
His kick seemed a model. The ball flew about chest height away to Bonner's right, but Paddy got a touch with both hands and all heaven broke loose.
I regard him as one of the finest sports writers in the English language anywhere in the world. I knew people who had no interest in sport over the years, but they read Con regularly in the evening press.
Wherever you went with Con, there was just great joy in it. People took to Con. People are attracted by Con, by his personality. But also in education. Wherever you went with him in the world, I remember being in places like Tirana in Albania with Con, and he'd give you an impromptu history lesson.
After about 2 years writing sport in the evening press, I felt that I was neglecting my old world of books and poetry. So I started a fortnightly series called Tributaries. There are 2 writers who, if all else failed, they would never fail me. Sherwood Anderson and Thomas Hardy. Anderson was obsessed with the need to articulate the poetry of the commonplace. He would have agreed with Thomas Hardy at the graveside of even the humblest man, you see his life as dramatic.
Well, I think Tributaries is a great name for that column because it flowed into the mainstream of Con's career and life. He may be best known as a sports writer, but Con was a student of life's rich tapestry in all its detail, and he was happy to give equal weight to a fine work of art or a well-worked goal. I mean, for Con there was no problem encompassing enthusiasm, and great enthusiasm at that, for Ernest Hemingway on the one hand and Mick O'Connell on the other, and they both frequently turned up in the same column. And I also think there's a bit of the old school teacher in Tributaries. I mean, Con taught in Renegan National School, as he'd say himself, up in the wild moorland between Listowel and Castle Island. I always remember he used to do really useful pieces coming up to the Leaving Cert every year, giving young scholars, as he called them, a bit of sound advice.
Renegown School was a mountain academy where most of the scholars were turf cutters' children. Every morning the boys brought sods of turf, the girls brought wild flowers. It recalls for me a few lines from the deserted village. There in his noisy mansion, skilled to rule, the village master taught his little school.
He got a letter from a man who wrote him about his Tributaries column, and he said, he thanked Con because he said, "You gave me my third level education."
This big mountainy man kind of ambled into the plush velvet seats of the Gaiety, and in his kind of gansy and paper stuck all out of every pocket. And said, "Who's he?" He said, "He's Con Houlihan. He's the new Irish evening press critic, I think he was." But he wrote with a great style. That was his big ability. He had a kind of unique style. I mean, he'd write about the play. Well, you think it was about the play, and if he quotes the piece, we'd be talking about Greek history or something else, and then in the last 3 words he said, "and about what happened in King Street last night."
Indeed, the language and style employed by critics could form an interesting study all of itself. There's a characteristic zest and energy about Con Houlihan, for example, who writes about sport as if it was an existential drama, and about theatre as if it was a great football match of life.
He would compare great events, great theatrical events, great writers, and put them in a sporting context. And it was a very neat turn of the coin, and it's something, again, which connected with a huge audience of Dublin readers. I think people read Tributaries that never read an arts column before or since.
He didn't take himself that seriously most of the time, and whereas some of the others took themselves unbelievably seriously. You know? I mean, some of their exits from the theatre when the curtain was hardly down was better than some of the exits from the actors on the stage. Look, I have to get back to Abbey Street, or I have to get back to Westmoreland Street. The world is waiting for the words I'm going to say about this play. Whereas Con would go off and have a few pints and a few drinks, and in his own inimitable way, with his big childish scrawl, would write the copy and send it in at 5 in the morning. But he at least had time to think about it.
A lot of his comments throughout the years have been about the nature of the essay. Robert Lind, for example, is one of his favorites, and he has written about Hazlitt, and he's written about people who could write terrific essays, and that's his ability. He can take a point and he can explore it logically and revealingly, say several things about it, and then he can close it off with an air of conviction.
T.S. Eliot said, writing or painting or music is about to take the present and the local in time and place and make it rich and strange. I think it's a marvellous definition of that.
Rugby is deeply rooted in Castle Island. It was played here before the birth of the Gaelic Athletic Association. It went back to the old game of cadge, of which rugby is a distilled form. The club survived many a crisis, mainly due to emigration. We often had a fine team, only to see the majority of them gone by the end of the season.
Oh, the training sessions were severe, especially coming up to the cup matches, like, you know. In the bad weather now, we'd be down in Rhino Mills, and they'd have like steps of stairs made out of the bags of barley, and you'd be running up and down there, maybe with Connie up on your back.
He used to get a lot of abuse, of course, and in terror playing rugby and BSC. But I played a good few matches with him. He nearly always played second row. Sometimes he played lock.
I played my socks. Sometimes I played my father's socks. And a dry day, if I wear boots, you could fly around the pitch. Boots are any encumbrance. Yeah. I couldn't kick you, I couldn't hurt you.
Okay, all right.
I am proud that here, Gaelic football and rugby coexisted side by side in the bitterest years of the ban. Of course, there were a few bigots in both camps, but the players couldn't care less. The poorer people in our community looked on rugby as their game. This attitude was not without a smidgen of irony. Rugby in this country was generally deemed the game of those who dwelt in the upper plateaus. In the world of sport, you'll find that poverty and passion go hand in hand. No club ever had more fervent followers than ours.
What you're doing is perfect, the depth is fine, but just work on passing the ball all in one go.
Rugby, more than any other game, satisfies the need for glory. Not glory in the sense of fame or tangible honour, but in the testing of your manhood and finding it not wanting. There is a spot in the pitch at Lansdowne Road that's known as the Castle Island Corner. It's at the junction of the goal line and the touchline, opposite the old Lansdowne Pavilion. Mick Doyle and Tom Doyle, and Moss Keane and Mick Galway all scored tries there in international games.
The campaign to try to refloat the press group, as was run by the NUJ, by the journalists, began inside Burke with an occupation, and then after a couple of weeks we moved our command post to room 103 of Liberty Hall.
In Liberty Hall in Dublin, Irish press journalists are still producing their own newspaper to raise funds while they wait for any sign of a breakthrough in the impasse.
Con weighed in right from word go. I mean, he didn't need any second asking. I remember his first job for the Express was selling copies of the paper on O'Connell Bridge, and it happened to be rare for that particular summer. It happened to be a rainy, miserable day, and Con later remarked on how he was afraid he'd get a cold or a flu or something, and in fact he said he could see the headline, which would be "Death of a Salesman."
The closure of Burke hurt him almost like a bereavement, and you could see that when in those days of the summer of '95, when people were clinging on to hope that the company titles would be transferred and revived, that Con was very serious part of that product.
Over that summer, I mean, it struck me and it struck a lot of the people who were involved in producing the Express, reading Con's stuff, that it was some of the best writing he'd ever done, and it was also very autobiographical. He had gone back to his childhood.
Fire at night, it'd be a rare occasion that the talk didn't turn to horses. I knew men who could trace the breeding of a horse, an ordinary working horse, back through several generations. They were equine genealogists.
Castle Island, so dear to me, in that green valley I'd long to be. Down by the main I'd love to roam. In Castle Island, my home, sweet home. I'm in exile, far, far away. On foreign shores I am my pain. Each day I dream that day will come when I'll be there, when old songs are sung.
At fairs, you'll see men that never owned a rood of ground, wrapped in the Freemasonry. On all the faces, you'll see the dream. It's their poetry, their bridge into the mysterious.
Whenever now I walk down Burke, I feel I'm a displaced person. I feel like O'Sheen, he came back after his 20-something years at Tea and Oak. The feeling were all gone. When I walk down there now, I feel very lonely, feel very lost, and I look at my house of dreams, and for me now it isn't there anymore. And I get a very bad feelings of loneliness here. Even the pubs are gone. The White House is gone, Martin Regan's is gone, but Morgan's remains the one bright spot in the grey world down there now. Yeah. Drink, it doesn't make you any more intelligent, but it stimulates your imagination basically. And I love to dream in pubs at night, and the following morning you can just let your dreams and thoughts into something that makes a bit of sense.
How's it going?
Went down the street.
Oh, it's crazy. It should never have happened. Did you think of the match Saturday?
Yes, I seen it.
We have a good pack this year.
Great pack, yes,
I don't think I'd be worried a bit about her three-quarters.
Great pack.
Great pack, yeah.
Midfield dodgy.
Midfield dodgy, especially with the absence of Bell now. Good luck to you, Con.
I carried on. But I never can be as happy as ever there. I couldn't be as happy as ever there. You know, that world is, it won't be recreated. But again, like the bog and the green fields, it was good to have it. I have great memories of camaraderie, of hard work, often very hard work, of fearful fights and arguments, but eventually getting the paper out, that was the important thing.
It struck me as quite incongruous at first that the Sunday World would be the latest forum, the forum for Con Houlihan. But then you look back and you see that it is the popular newspapers that have forged the way with sports journalism. Way back in Ireland in the 19th century, we virtually invented the notion of sports journalism as a legitimate form of journalism, and it was taken up by the popular newspapers in England. Now, in the Sunday World, you'll have crime bosses and lap dancing at the front of the paper, and you have Con's quite high literary style at the back. He's very comfortable with that audience, and it shows how disparate the Irish audience for popular newspapers are. I don't think you'd see the same thing happening with the tabloids in America or with the tabloids in London. It's something distinctively Irish.
Portobello, it's a village, it's still a village. And most of all, it has people from the world outside. Black Africans, white Africans, yellow Africans, Chinese, Pakistanis, Italians, very much so indeed, and Kerry people. It's a good mix. And I feel part of it. So I don't think I'll ever again live in Kerry. I think I'll live where I am now, in Portobello. And it's a great substitute. You couldn't ask for better. I'm very happy up around here. It's my country. Until I die, I suppose I'll probably die right in this house. I probably will, you know. Unromantic but true.
He was regarded generally as a stylist. Anybody who knew anything about English saw him as a stylist. And in fact, I often felt myself that his style and what he was capable of doing with words and with syntax was somewhat wasted in writing, you know, columns in newspapers, that he was capable of something much better. But anyway, that was Con's decision. He continued with it.
I'm not sure if in the world of evening newspaper journalism, where everything is shoveled out and deadline is king and everybody's shouting at each other and there's terrible stress and pressure, that sort of enormous literary presence was appreciated by everyone. In the days of €1,000,000 advances for 22-year-old authors, I think Con, if he was arriving now, would be treated in a different way, and we would have something much more permanent. Because there is a saying, you know, I think Tom O'Shea, Con's great friend and sports editor of the Evening Press, used to say, we're tomorrow's fish and chips.
All Con ever needs to do is to embark on something. It's like the beginning of the football match, and he will see it through to the end. Maybe he has been writing a novel, maybe he has been writing a play or a collection of short stories, but he hasn't, I certainly haven't heard a word of it from him. But then his shyness might be concealing it.
My book will be called An Leabhar, or Liber in Latin. It will be a book about books and a book about life. It will be my quintessence. It will be my totality as much as I can articulate it. I'll throw my bread onto the water. I'll put my ware in front of the public and the critics, and they can say what they like.
I hope I never lose my passion for writing. And when the day comes that I won't see my Byron and be feeling good, excited, and give up completely, I'll go back making poutine or whatever. Yeah.
Here at the Nun's Pool, I have often come to refresh my spirit. To me, it is probably my favorite spot in the whole world. The Australian Aborigines would understand. They have their sacred places. Ayers Rock is to them as the Nun's Pool is to me. Again, I recall the Greek poet Kephafi. In those fields and streets where you grew up, there you will always live, and there you will die.